There is a farm in southern Africa where the grass grows tall between the fence posts and the acacia trees throw long shadows across red dirt. It is the kind of place that seems, from a distance, perfectly still, perfectly ordinary. A wire fence, a wooden gate, a rusting latch, things that have stood in that same position for years without anyone giving them a second thought. But something has been watching that gate, something patient, something that remembers. If you have ever wondered whether wild animals are capable of true problem solving, whether they can observe a mechanism, understand its function, and deliberately repeat a behavior that gets them what they want, then what happened on this farm is going to change the way you think about the animals sharing this planet with us. Because a pack of African wild dogs did not stumble through an open gate, they did not squeeze under a loose fence post. They studied the latch, they learned the motion, and over the course of several months, they opened that gate 14 times. 14 times. This is not a story about luck or accident. This is a story about intelligence, about social learning, about what happens when one of Africa's most misunderstood and underestimated predators decides that the thing standing between it and a meal is worth figuring out. This is a story about what wild minds are truly capable of when we stop underestimating them. If you want more stories like this one, more moments where the natural world does something that stops you cold and makes you reconsider everything, then stay with us. There is a lot more coming, and you will not want to miss a single chapter. Now let us go back to the beginning. The African wild dog, Lycaon pictus, which translates roughly as painted wolf, is one of the most socially sophisticated predators on Earth. They are not wolves. They are not hyenas. They belong to a genus entirely their own, a lineage that has been evolving separately for millions of years. They are lean and long-legged, with enormous rounded ears that swivel like radar dishes, and their coats are splashed with irregular patches of black, brown, white, and gold, no two animals patterned alike. Each coat is as individual as a fingerprint. They live in packs, and within those packs, the level of cooperation and communication is extraordinary. Wild dogs vote before a hunt. Not metaphorically, not loosely speaking. They actually vote. A dog that wants to move signals this by sneezing, and if enough sneezes accumulate, the pack gets up and goes. The threshold for departure depends on rank. A dominant individual needs fewer votes behind them. A lower-ranking dog needs more support before the group will follow. This is democracy on four legs, operating in a language of breath and body, refined over thousands of generations on the open plains of Africa. They share food. A returning hunter will regurgitate meat for pack members who could not join the chase. They care for the injured. They allow elderly dogs to feed before the young. In some documented packs, a member missing a leg has been kept alive for years by the communal generosity of its family. In most predator societies, weakness is a death sentence. In a wild dog pack, it is met with accommodation. They are also, by almost every measure of hunting success, the most effective large predators in Africa. Their kill success rate hovers somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending on the study and the conditions. Lions, for comparison, succeed roughly 20 to 30% of the time. Leopards, similarly. Cheetahs a little higher in open terrain. But wild dogs, with their relentless cooperative pursuit strategy, their ability to run prey to exhaustion over distances that would break other predators, succeed more often than they fail. On a flat run, they can sustain speeds of 50 kilometers per hour for several kilometers. They do not sprint and give up. They run and run and run until the prey has nothing left. And yet, despite all of this, wild dogs are vanishing. There are fewer than 7,000 left across the entire continent. They have been persecuted by farmers who see them as a threat to livestock. They have been poisoned, snared, and shot. Their habitat has been fragmented by roads and fences and agriculture until many packs live in isolated islands of wild land, cut off from other packs, unable to disperse, unable to find mates, slowly losing the genetic diversity that keeps a population healthy. So when a pack of wild dogs chooses to make its territory in land that butts up against human settlement, it is not making a careless mistake. It is an act of adaptation in a world that has left them very little room to maneuver. Which brings us back to the farm. The pack in question was first identified by researchers from a wildlife monitoring project operating across a broad stretch of communal and privately held land in the region. They had been tracking the pack using a combination of radio collar data, remote camera traps, and on-the-ground observation. It was a mid-sized pack, somewhere between 8 and 12 adults at various points in the study, with a breeding female, a dominant male, several subordinate adults of both sexes, and at different times of year, juveniles learning the ropes of pack life. The farm sat at the edge of the pack's territory. It was a working farm, cattle and goats primarily, with a small vegetable operation closer to the homestead. The owner had lived there for decades. He had seen wild dogs before. He had, in the past, lost animals to predators of various kinds, and he maintained his fences with the attention and care of someone who understood that a fence was not a luxury but a practical necessity. The main gate was a standard farm gate, the kind you find all across the region. Heavy gauge wire forming a rectangular panel, hinged on one side, latched on the other. The latch was a simple gravity-fed hook, a bent piece of metal that dropped into a loop and held the gate closed under its own weight. It was not locked. It was not padlocked. It did not need to be, because opening it required a combination of movements, lifting the hook and then pushing or pulling the gate through its arc, that most animals were not going to accidentally stumble through. The first camera trap image that suggested something unusual was happening was ambiguous. It showed a wild dog standing at the gate, standing very close to the gate, its nose near the latch. The image was time-stamped in the early morning hours, well before dawn. The dog appeared to be investigating. This was not remarkable in itself. Wild dogs investigate things. They are curious animals. Their enormous ears and extraordinary noses are constantly gathering information about the world around them, and a gate with the smell of cattle on it and the residue of human hands is genuinely interesting to a wild dog nose. What made the researcher who reviewed that image pause was a second image, captured 47 minutes later. The gate was open. There was no human on site. There was no indication of any other disturbance. The cattle were unsettled and had moved to the far end of their enclosure. And when the researcher went back through the camera trap footage from that night, frame by frame, she found it. A single dog. Standing at the gate, nosing at the latch, backing up, coming forward again. And then, in a sequence that took approximately 3 minutes from first contact to final movement, lifting the latch with its muzzle, holding it, and pushing the gate forward. The gate swung open on its hinges. The dog stepped back, waited. Others from the pack emerged from the darkness. They poured through. They were inside. That first incident lasted less than 20 minutes. The dogs moved through, investigated the outer edge of the cattle enclosure without making direct contact with the animals, and then left. The farmer found the gate open in the morning and assumed he had forgotten to latch it properly. He latched it again. He did not check the camera trap because on that occasion he was not aware the camera trap was positioned there. That was part of a monitoring effort being run independently. The second incident occurred 11 days later. This time, the researcher was reviewing footage routinely and saw it again. Same gate, different time of night, earlier. Same dog, she believed, based on the coat pattern. The animal approached, manipulated the latch, and opened the gate. But this time, something else happened. Before the dog pushed the gate, it paused. It turned its head back toward the darkness behind it. It appeared to be looking toward the rest of the pack. And then, only after that pause, it opened the gate. Whether that pause was deliberate communication or simply a behavioral artifact, a moment of hesitation before committing to the action, is impossible to say with certainty from a single image. But the researcher noted it carefully. She noted it because it raised a question that she was not yet ready to answer definitively. Was the dog that had learned to open the gate signaling in some way to the others? Was there a social component to this behavior beyond just one individual doing something unusual? The gate was found open again the next morning. The farmer was now concerned. He replaced the latch with a slightly stiffer version, requiring more force to lift. The pack did not return for 3 weeks. When they did, the new latch was open too. This is the point at which the behavior stops being an interesting anomaly and becomes something worth examining much more carefully, because a wild dog that opens a latch once might be stumbling through a novel behavior, exploring by chance. A wild dog that opens a new and stiffer latch, after a gap, having apparently adapted to the change, is doing something else entirely. It is demonstrating persistence. It is demonstrating that the goal, entry through that specific point, has been maintained across weeks. It is demonstrating that when the mechanism changed, the animal recalibrated and solved the new version of the problem. By this point, the research team had begun paying considerably closer attention. They installed additional cameras. They also, with the cooperation of the farmer, began a more systematic documentation effort. Every gate opening was now recorded in detail. Time of day, which animals were present, how long the behavior took, whether it was always the same individual performing it, and what the pack did afterward. What emerged over the following months was a picture of considerable complexity. The gate was opened 14 times in total, over a period of roughly 5 months. On 12 of those occasions, the same individual performed the actual latch manipulation. She was a female, not the dominant breeding female, but a subordinate adult, approximately 3 to 4 years old, based on the researchers' estimates. They named her in their notes, as researchers often do with frequently observed individuals, though the name itself was simply a field identifier. What mattered was that this single animal had developed, maintained, and repeatedly deployed a specific learned skill that the rest of the pack did not seem to individually possess. On 2 of the 14 occasions, a different dog opened the gate. A younger male, probably born in the litter, before the one currently accompanying the pack as juveniles. On both of those occasions, the original female was present, but did not approach the gate herself. The male went to the gate, spent longer at it than the female typically did, made several attempts, and succeeded. Whether he learned by watching the female, and whether those 2 successful openings represent the early stages of the behavior spreading through the pack via social transmission, is one of the most fascinating questions the data raises. Social learning in wild dogs is well established in certain contexts. Young dogs learn to hunt by accompanying experienced hunters. They learn which prey is worth pursuing and which is dangerous by watching the reactions of older pack members. They learn the sounds and signals of pack communication by immersion in the group from birth. But the idea that a specific technical skill, a physical manipulation of a man-made object, might be transmitted socially from one individual to another, watched, practiced, and eventually replicated, places wild dog cognition in a category that researchers have more typically reserved for primates, corvids, and cetaceans. It is worth pausing here to consider what we mean when we talk about animal intelligence, because the word itself is loaded with assumptions that can lead us astray. For most of human history, intelligence was treated as a linear scale with humans at the top and everything else arranged below, with proximity to humans on the scale roughly corresponding to how similar to us an animal seemed. Great apes were near the top because they look like us, use their hands like us, show emotions that we recognize. Fish were near the bottom because they are cold and silent and alien in their movements. Dogs somewhere in the comfortable middle, trusted and familiar. But what the science of animal cognition has been telling us for decades, with increasing clarity, is that this model is wrong. Intelligence is not a ladder, it is a landscape. Every species has evolved the cognitive tools that its particular life requires. A Clark's nutcracker can remember the location of thousands of cached seeds across a vast geographic range through multiple seasons. A human cannot do this. An octopus can solve a mechanical puzzle on the first attempt, with no prior experience of the relevant mechanism. A chimpanzee can memorize and recall sequences of numbers at speeds that humiliate trained human adults. A domestic dog can infer the location of a hidden object from the gaze direction of a human, a skill that requires understanding something about other minds that our closest ape relatives often fail at in the same test. Wild dogs, with their complex social structure, their cooperative hunting requiring real-time coordination across multiple individuals, and their long-term bonds and relationships within the pack, have always been expected by researchers to show sophisticated cognition. What the Farmgate story adds to that picture is something specific and compelling. This is not abstract social intelligence. This is physical problem solving. This is tool use in the loosest sense of the term, an animal deliberately manipulating a physical object in its environment to achieve a specific goal that it has clearly represented internally, because it comes back and does it again, because it tries a modified version when the mechanism changes, because it does not forget between visits. The pack was not starving. This is worth noting. Wild dogs in good condition, with access to a functional hunting range, do not typically take serious predation risks for marginal gains. Going onto a farm to investigate livestock is a risk, not an obvious reward for a pack that has other options. Which suggests that the gate opening may have begun not as a direct hunting strategy, but as something closer to exploration, to curiosity. The behavior may have been reinforced over time if the pack found something inside, even if it was just the novelty of a new space, a concentration of prey smell, or a successful hunt on some of those 14 occasions. The farmer was, to his considerable credit, patient. When the research team approached him, explained what they were seeing, and asked permission to document the behavior more thoroughly, he agreed. He was a man who had complicated feelings about wild dogs. He had lost animals to predators over the years, and wild dogs carried part of that history for him, but he was also observant enough to recognize that what was happening at his gate was unusual, and he was willing, if only out of curiosity, to let the recording continue before taking action. He did eventually install a padlock, a simple two-step lock that required both lifting and rotating a separate component before the gate could be moved. The 14 documented openings all occurred before the padlock was installed. After it was installed, the pack was observed approaching the gate on 3 subsequent occasions. The female, who had performed most of the openings, spent time at the new mechanism. She did not open it. Whether she would have eventually is a question without an answer. The pack's territory shifted over the following months, as wild dog territories do. Their range is not static. They follow prey, they respond to pressures, and they move. The farm gate became less central to their activities, and eventually the visits stopped. But they left behind something that the research team has spent considerable time working through since. A data set that does not fit neatly into any existing category, that raises more questions than it answers, and that tells us something genuinely important about the nature of animal minds. Let us go deeper into what the pack was actually doing during those 14 incursions, because the gate opening was only the entry point, literally and figuratively, into the behavior that followed. Of the 14 times the gate was opened, the pack did not always enter. On 2 occasions, the gate was opened, and then the dogs stood at the threshold for several minutes before withdrawing without crossing. This is extremely interesting. It suggests the opening itself was not a reflexive chain of behavior, automatically followed by entry. There was assessment. There was something, whether internal decision-making or response to environmental stimuli that night, that led the pack to decide on at least 2 occasions that entering was not the right call. On the 12 occasions they did enter, their behavior inside was cautious and systematic in a way that reflects the wild dog's characteristic wariness. They did not rush toward the livestock. They moved slowly, spread out, keeping contact with each other through the low, soft calls they use for close-range communication. They investigated fence lines, corners, water troughs. They moved in the way that any intelligent predator moves through an unfamiliar environment, gathering information, mapping the space, identifying exits. On several of those 12 visits, there is no clear evidence of any direct predation. The livestock were disturbed, the cattle clustered and agitated, but there was no blood, no injury, no carcass found by the farmer the next morning. On a smaller number of visits, there was evidence of a kill. In each of those cases, the evidence was removed, consumed on site or carried off, and the pack was gone before dawn. This pattern is consistent with something that researchers studying predator behavior in fragmented habitats have documented repeatedly. Animals operating near human settlement develop what can reasonably be called operational caution. They learn the rhythms of human activity. They learn when it is safe to move and when it is not. Wild dogs, which are primarily diurnal, meaning they prefer to hunt in the early morning and evening light, have been documented shifting to more nocturnal activity in areas with high human pressure. The farm visits all occurred at night, well outside the hours when farm activity would normally be at its peak. This is behavioral plasticity in action. The pack was not blindly following instincts calibrated to an open savanna with no humans. It was adjusting, learning, and operating with a sophistication that the simple label predator does not begin to capture. There is a broader story here about what happens to wild dogs in the modern African landscape, and it is a story that both breaks the heart and, in moments like this one, fills it with something closer to awe. Wild dogs need space. More space than almost any other large carnivore relative to their body size. A pack may have a home range of several hundred square kilometers. They need to be able to disperse, which means young adults leaving their natal pack to find mates and form new packs, which requires connected habitat. Fence a landscape tightly enough, and you end up with isolated genetic islands that slowly degrade. Get the fences wrong, and you fragment movement corridors that predators and prey have used for thousands of years. Farmers have not been wrong to see wild dogs as a challenge. A pack of wild dogs encountering a goat enclosure with a simple latch is a real economic problem for a family whose livelihood depends on those animals. The history of wild dog persecution is not a story of pure human malice. It is a story of genuine conflict between people trying to survive and animals trying to survive, compressed into a landscape that keeps shrinking for both of them. But the conflict is not inevitable. And the work being done across the region by conservationists, researchers, and farmers working together is demonstrating that it is possible to build a landscape where both can coexist. Livestock guarding programs, predator-proof enclosures for high-value animals, community-based monitoring that gives farmers real-time information about where packs are and where they are moving, compensation schemes for verified predator losses, insurance models that reduce the financial catastrophe of a single raid. These approaches do not eliminate conflict entirely, but they reduce it enough that a farmer like the one in this story can look at a camera trap image of a wild dog opening his gate and feel, alongside the frustration, something like respect, because that is what the animal deserves. Now let us talk about what was happening inside the pack during those months, because the gate opening did not occur in a social vacuum. It was embedded in the life of a pack, and that life is worth understanding in its full detail. Wild dog packs are built around a single breeding pair, the dominant male and female. These two animals produce the pups. In most seasons, no other female in the pack breeds, not because she is prevented by force in the direct sense, but because the social suppression of reproduction in subordinate females is intense and physiologically real. Stress hormones associated with subordinate status can suppress the reproductive cycle at a biochemical level. The pack structure itself acts as a form of reproductive regulation, channeling the group's collective effort into raising a single litter. The breeding female in this pack had a litter in the spring before the gate opening incidents began. Pups in a wild dog pack spend their earliest weeks in a den, a hole in the ground, often a repurposed aardvark burrow that provides shelter from the African sun and from predators. The entire pack participates in raising those pups. Every adult returns from hunts and regurgitates meat for the pups and for any adults that stayed behind to guard the den. The pups nurse, they play, they begin to learn the social rules of the pack through constant interaction with adults who are, to a degree that is remarkable among carnivores, patient teachers. By the time the gate opening incidents began, the pups were approximately 5 to 6 months old. They were mobile, they were fast, and they were accompanying the pack on movements, though not yet on serious hunts. This is a critical developmental period. It is the time when young wild dogs are absorbing everything, watching everything, filing away information that will shape their behavior for the rest of their lives. Those juveniles were present during at least some of the gate visits. What did they see? What did they retain? The researchers do not know yet. The pack dispersed before the juveniles reached adulthood and were tracked away from the farm area. Whether any of them carry forward a behavioral template for gate manipulation, whether the knowledge that a gate can be opened is somewhere in their experience available for future retrieval, is a question that may never have a clean answer, but the question itself is worth sitting with. We tend to think of cultural transmission in animals, the passing of learned behaviors through social observation rather than genetic inheritance, as something we have only recently begun to understand. The famous cases are well known. Macaques in Japan washing sweet potatoes in seawater, a behavior that spread through a troop and was passed to subsequent generations. Chimpanzees in West Africa using stone hammers to crack nuts, a technology that varies between populations in ways that can only be explained by local cultural tradition rather than by genetics or ecology. Humpback whales inventing a new feeding technique called lobtail feeding and spreading it through contact between populations at a speed that maps exactly onto the social network of the whales rather than geographic proximity. These are the headline cases. But cultural transmission, social learning, the inheritance of behavior through observation and imitation, is far more widespread in the animal kingdom than we once believed. It has been documented in birds, in fish, in insects, in rodents. It does not require the complexity of language. It does not require conscious intention. It requires only that one animal can watch another and reproduce a behavior that is reinforced by outcome. The junior male in this pack who opened the gate twice, after watching the dominant female open it many times, represents exactly this kind of transfer. He watched. He learned the association between the movement and the outcome. He tried it himself. He succeeded. That is cultural transmission happening in real time, documented on camera trap footage, in a species that we classify as endangered, and often encounter in conservation contexts, primarily as victims of human pressure. There is something important in that recontextualization. Wild dogs are not passive recipients of a shrinking world. They are active problem solvers, responding to novel challenges with the cognitive tools their evolution has given them. The same pack cohesion that makes them such effective hunters makes them effective learners. The same communication that coordinates a 5-kilometer chase coordinates the transfer of a new behavior through a group. The same social bonds that sustain an injured member through months of recovery sustain the collective intelligence that turns one individual's discovery into a pack-level capability. This is what 7,000 animals remaining in the wild actually means, not just a number approaching a threshold, not just a conservation statistic. It means 7,000 animals like this one. 7,000 carriers of complex social knowledge, learned behaviors, accumulated pack wisdom. Each pack that disappears takes with it a unique cultural repertoire, a specific set of learned adaptations to a specific landscape that cannot be reconstructed from scratch. The genetic loss is real, the cultural loss is equally real and far less discussed. The farm in this story still stands. The gate now has a padlock, the cattle are quiet in their enclosure, and somewhere, across the broad sweep of savanna and scrubland that the wild dogs call home, a pack is moving. The dominant female is at the front. The juveniles, now nearly adult, are just behind her. They have been up since before dawn. They have already run 6 kilometers. They have made 1 kill, a young impala that did not accelerate quickly enough when the pack cut it from the herd. They ate well. Now they are moving again, trotting with that loose, effortless stride that looks unhurried until you try to keep pace with it. Their ears turn constantly, independent of each other, sampling the sonic landscape in all directions. Their noses work without ceasing. The savanna gives them information that we cannot read, a text written in scent and sound that they parse with an ease that our instruments can barely approximate. They pass a fence line. One of the younger animals pauses at a gate. It is not the gate, not the same farm, not the same mechanism, just a gate. The animal stands there for a moment, nose near the latch. Then the rest of the pack moves on and it follows. It does not stay. It does not try the latch. But it stopped. And it looked. Whether that means anything is something we cannot know for certain. Whether the sight of a farm gate activates some residual pattern in an animal that watched another animal open one months ago on a different farm is a question at the very edge of what we understand about memory and cognition in wild carnivores. But the stop, that pause, that interest, is a small and quiet thing worth noticing, because it suggests that the world these animals inhabit is not just a physical landscape of grass and prey and water. It is also a cognitive landscape, dense with remembered experience, with observed solutions to past problems, with the accumulated knowledge of a social group that has been solving challenges together since before any of these individual animals were born. The African wild dog is not simply surviving. It is thinking its way through a world that has become, in the span of a few human generations, almost unrecognizably different from the one its ancestors evolved in. It is encountering problems its evolutionary history could not have prepared it for. Fences and farms and roads, and the particular kind of barrier that a gate latch represents. And it is finding answers. Not always. Not for every problem. The species is still in serious trouble, still losing ground to habitat loss and disease and human persecution, and the slow grinding pressure of a continent that has less and less wild space to offer. But 14 times, on one farm, in one season, a single painted wolf walked up to a mechanism designed to keep things out, figured out how it worked, and opened it, and then taught that knowledge to another member of her pack. 14 times. That is not luck. That is not accident. That is a mind at work. Let us think about the mechanics of that learning process more carefully, because it illuminates something important about the nature of animal problem solving that goes beyond the specific case of the gate. When researchers study how animals solve novel mechanical problems, they distinguish broadly between 2 types of learning. The first is trial and error. An animal interacts with an object, explores it without any particular strategy, and stumbles upon a solution through accumulated random exploration. The second is more directed, what some researchers call goal emulation, or understanding of causal relationships, where an animal that observes a behavior performed by another animal does not simply copy the motor movements, but understands, at some level, what the goal of those movements was, and constructs its own approach to achieving the same goal. The distinction matters because the second type requires something richer than simple imitation. It requires the observer to represent the goal as a goal, to hold in mind the outcome being sought, and to recognize when the actions of the observed animal are relevant to that outcome. It is a building block of genuine causal reasoning, of the kind of intelligence that can generalize from specific observed cases to novel situations. When the junior male in this pack opened the gate on 2 occasions, he did not copy the exact motor sequence used by the female. The researchers, watching the footage carefully, noted that his approach was different. He spent longer at the latch. He tried from a slightly different angle. He succeeded through what appeared to be his own working out of the mechanism, informed by but not identical to what he had seen the female do. That pattern is consistent with goal emulation rather than pure imitation. He had watched the female and extracted from her behavior not a specific set of movements to replicate, but a goal. The gate can be opened. It happens at the latch, nose or muzzle applied there will achieve something, and a rough sense of where to direct his attention. The specific solution he found was his own. This is, in the language of cognitive science, a relatively sophisticated form of social learning. It is the kind of learning that allows knowledge to be transmitted across individuals, even when the precise motor capabilities, or body size, or approach angle of the learner differ from those of the demonstrator. It is flexible and it is generative. It produces learners who can innovate around a transmitted principle rather than just copy a fixed action. Whether wild dogs do this routinely, as a general cognitive capacity, or whether this case represents an unusual individual with unusual cognitive gifts, is not yet clear. The research base on wild dog cognition is thinner than we would like, partly because wild dogs are difficult to study, partly because there are so few of them, and partly because, until recently, very little attention was paid to wild dog behavior beyond the logistics of pack hunting and the demographics of population decline. That is changing. The gate story is part of a growing literature that treats wild dogs not as conservation objects to be counted and tracked, but as cognitive subjects whose inner lives deserve serious investigation. There are other documented cases, less dramatic than 14 gate openings but cumulatively telling. Wild dogs in peri-urban areas learning the schedules of garbage collection and timing their visits to coincide with peak opportunity. Pack members apparently communicating the location of novel food sources through behavior at the rendezvous site that goes beyond the simple regurgitation reflex. Individuals in captivity solving multi-step puzzle feeders in ways that suggest forward planning rather than purely reactive behavior. The picture that is emerging is of an animal with a cognitive profile that matches its social complexity. A species that lives in intricate long-term relationships, that makes decisions collectively, that navigates a dynamic social hierarchy without the constant enforcement of physical dominance typical of many other carnivore societies, has to be reading others carefully, modeling their intentions and likely responses, maintaining long-term memory of relationship history, and adjusting behavior in light of all of this continuously. These are the foundations of complex cognition. The gate is, in this light, not a miracle. It is a natural expression of what this animal's mind is built to do. Now let us speak for a moment about what this story asks of us. The conflict between wild predators and farming communities is real, and it is ongoing across the entire range of the African wild dog. It plays out in countless variations. A raided goat enclosure here, a lost calf there, a dog poisoned in retaliation, a snare set along a track that predators and domestic animals both use. Each individual event is small. Their accumulation is catastrophic. Conservation efforts that ignore the reality of this conflict, that speak only of the animal's ecological value, without addressing the very real economic cost that falls on communities living at the boundary of wild land, do not work. The evidence is overwhelming, and it has been generated by enough failed initiatives over enough decades to constitute a clear lesson. Protection that is imposed without community benefit has no foundation. It erodes the moment external enforcement relaxes. An external enforcement cannot be maintained indefinitely. It cannot be maintained even most of the time, across landscapes as vast and as economically strained as those in which the African wild dog still survives. What can work, what is working in places where the effort has been made to build it properly, is a genuine alignment between the economic interests of local communities and the survival of the wildlife those communities live alongside. When a pack of wild dogs is worth more alive than dead, not abstractly, not through the distant mechanism of national conservation policy, but concretely, through employment and monitoring programs, through ecotourism revenue flowing into local hands, through functioning compensation schemes that make a predator loss something other than a financial catastrophe, then the calculus changes. It changes slowly, and it changes incompletely, but it changes. The farmer who watched a wild dog open his gate